When Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States in December 1941, the German military establishment felt little concern. To the aristocratic Prussian-trained generals of the German High Command, warfare was an exact science, an art form perfected over centuries of discipline, pedigree, and iron-willed obedience. The Wehrmacht stood as the most professional, battle-hardened military on earth, having recently conquered most of Europe in a matter of months. As they looked across the Atlantic at the United States, they did not see a credible military threat. They saw a nation of shopkeepers, factory workers, and farm boys. Joseph Goebbels and the Nazi propaganda machine had spent years portraying Americans as a mongrel nation, soft, decadent, and culturally inferior. The German High Command genuinely believed that Americans were capitalist, playboys, and jazz-addicted gangsters who had absolutely no martial spirit. They assumed a nation that idolized the automobile and cinema could never endure the primal, bloody horror of a modern battlefield. When the first green American troops landed in North Africa in 1942, the Germans initially felt vindicated. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass, Erwin Rommel's Afrika Corps shattered the inexperienced American lines, forcing the U.S. Second Corps into a humiliating, chaotic retreat. The German officers sneered, writing home that the Americans were exactly as expected cowards in expensive uniforms who couldn't fight. But the German High Command had made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed the Americans they fought at Kasserine were the finished product. They failed to realize the American Army was perhaps the fastest learning organization in the history of warfare. And when they met again in the hedgerows of France and the forests of Germany, they were about to face a series of terrifying realizations. The first major shock to German tactical doctrine was the baffling unpredictability of the common American soldier. The German military system was incredibly rigid at a strategic level, relying on highly trained officers to execute meticulous plans. If a German plan was disrupted, or if its commanding officers were killed, a German unit would often halt, awaiting new orders from the chain of command. The Americans, however, were entirely different. An apocryphal quote, often attributed to a frustrated German general, perfectly captured their nightmare. The reason the American Army does so well in wartime is that war is chaos, and the American Army practices chaos on a daily basis. You cannot predict what they will do because they don't even read their own manuals. Whether the quote is precise or not, the sentiment was historically accurate. German officers were horrified to find that American enlisted men, sergeants, corporals, even privates, were actively encouraged to think for themselves. If an American lieutenant was killed by a sniper, the 20-year-old sergeant from Chicago wasn't going to wait for a replacement. He would simply take command, assess the objective, throw the original plan out the window, and invent a new tactic right on the spot. To the highly regimented German mind, this was more than just undisciplined. It was terrifying. The Germans could set up a perfect defensive ambush, only to see the Americans do something completely irrational, like smashing a tank through a building instead of using the road, or welding steel teeth to the belled front of their tanks to tear through the hedgerows of Normandy. The Germans couldn't anticipate American tactics, because the Americans were making them up as they went. And while the German panzer tanks often dominated the headlines, the average German infantryman, the Lancer, had learned to fear something else entirely. The greatest shock to the German army was the apocalyptic power, speed, and precision of United States field artillery. German artillery was certainly powerful, but it was often horse-drawn, slow to communicate, and rigid in its targeting. When a German unit called for artillery support, the request had to go up the chain of command, be approved, and then manually calculated. The American system, by contrast, was centralized in the Fire Direction Center, or FDC, and operated with a speed the Germans found almost supernatural. Every American unit had radios, from platoon commanders all the way to the artillery batteries. If an American squad was pinned, down by a German machine gun, they didn't wait hours for support. They could radio the coordinates, and within 3 minutes, high-explosive shells would be raining down on that exact position. But the true terror came from an American invention called Time on Target, or TOT. In a standard artillery barrage, guns fire as they become ready, creating a scattered bombardment that gives an enemy time to dive for cover. In a TOT strike, American officers calculated the precise flight time of shells from dozens of different batteries stationed miles apart. They would then synchronize the firing sequence so that hundreds of shells fired from different places at different times would all impact the target at the exact same split second. German soldiers who survived TOT strikes described them as the end of the world. There was no warning whistle. There was no time to seek cover. One moment, a German battalion was marching down a road. The next millisecond, the entire grid square simply vanished in a single earth-shattering explosion. The Germans learned that the soft Americans had mathematically perfected the art of industrial slaughter. The German High Command had always prided itself on its martial spirit and warrior ethos. They believed wars were won by the superiority of the individual soldier. The Americans introduced them to a new and crushing reality, the war of logistics. By 1944, the German army was starving. It was running out of fuel, running out of ammunition, and relying on horse-drawn carts to supply even its elite panzer divisions. German officers expected to face an enemy that was struggling with the same battlefield friction. Instead, it was as if they'd met an alien empire of infinite resources. When German troops finally overran American positions, they were completely demoralized by what they saw. They expected to find desperately low ammunition stores. Instead, they saw mountains of crates. They found fresh, hot coffee. They discovered Hershey's chocolate bars. They found soldiers receiving mail from home every single week who had unlimited supplies of gasoline, spare parts, and medical plasma. A famous story details a captured German officer being driven to the rear through American supply lines. He watched endless miles of 2.5-ton trucks moving bumper to bumper, delivering an absolute ocean of supplies. He reportedly broke down in tears, realizing Germany hadn't just lost a tactical war. They were fighting a mechanical god that could simply bury the Third Reich under a mountain of steel and rubber. Despite this American material advantage, some German commanders still clung to the belief that the American infantrymen lacked true grit. They believed without their tanks and airplanes, the Americans would refuse to fight a brutal, face-to-face war of attrition. The Battle of the Hürtgen Forest would shatter that illusion forever. In the autumn of 1944, the Americans pushed into the Hürtgen, a dark, dense, freezing pine forest on the German border. The terrain was so thick that American tanks couldn't maneuver, and the weather was so bad their planes couldn't fly. The Americans were suddenly stripped of all their technological advantages. It became a primal fight of infantry versus infantry in the mud, the mines, and the freezing rain. The Germans defended fiercely, expecting the Americans to break and retreat when faced with such horrific casualties. But the Americans did not break. Division after division was fed into this meat grinder. Men fought hand-to-hand with entrenching tools and bayonets in the freezing mud. They suffered staggering losses, over 33,000 casualties in the forest alone, but they just kept coming. The German officers were stunned. These so-called playboys were enduring conditions that rivaled the worst horrors of the Eastern Front. They proved that beneath the radios and the jeeps, the American farm boy and the city kid possessed a terrifying, stubborn tenacity. The final, ultimate realization came during Hitler's last desperate gamble, the Battle of the Bulge, in December 1944. The German 5th Panzer Army, under General Hasso von Manteuffel, completely surrounded the vital crossroads town of Bastogne. Trapped inside were the exhausted, freezing, and undersupplied paratroopers of the American 101st Airborne Division. According to German military doctrine and basic military logic, when a lightly armed force is completely surrounded by heavy armor, cut off from resupply, and freezing to death, the only sane option is to surrender. General von Manteuffel sent a formal, typed ultimatum to the American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, demanding his honorable surrender to save his men from complete annihilation. The German officers confidently waited for the white flag. Instead, they received a one-word reply that absolutely broke their brains. The official typed response from the American general was simply, "Nuts." The German officers literally needed a translator just to explain what it meant. When they finally realized it was the American equivalent of "go to hell," they were enraged. But they were also deeply unsettled. The Americans simply didn't care that they were surrounded. In the minds of the paratroopers, being surrounded just meant they could fire in any direction and hit a German. For one solid week, the 101st Airborne absorbed everything the German war machine threw at them. They fought in the snow, out of ammunition, scavenging weapons from the dead, and they absolutely refused to yield a single inch of ground. When George S. Patton's Third Army finally broke through the siege, the German High Command's spirit was fundamentally broken. After the war ended, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, one of Germany's most senior and respected commanders, was interrogated by the Allies. When asked about the American soldier, the man who once saw them as inferior, amateurs offered a grim and respectful assessment. The German military had spent centuries perfecting warfare from the top down, but they were defeated by a nation that built its military from the bottom up. The German officers had expected a soft, predictable enemy. Instead, they awoke the sleeping giant that didn't play by the old world's rules. They met an army where a mechanic could invent a new tank attachment, or where a telephone operator could call down the wrath of the gods with a radio, and where a private with a cigarette would look a panzer tank dead in the eye and tell it to go to hell. The Germans learned, far too late, that the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield wasn't Krupp steel or Prussian doctrine. It was the terrifying ingenuity and the unyielding wrath of the American citizen soldier.